Hello, I am Idi Amin, and I would like to share my story with you. There have been many unhinged leaders throughout history, but few have been as depraved as the man who terrorized Uganda during the 1970s with his fondness for torture, severed heads, and, by his own admission, cannibalism. I truly earned the description given to me by the man I replaced as Ugandan president, Milton Obote, the greatest brute that an African mother has brought to life. I was born between 1925 and 1928 in Koboko, Uganda. I belong to the Kakwa tribe, of which my mother was the witch doctor. I had very little formal education, but was well versed in the teachings of the Quran from an early age. In fact, I developed a reputation as the boy who could recite the Quran. In my early teens, I won an award for this ability. As a young boy, I spent my days in the fields tending goats. In my mid-teens, I landed my first job as a hat and coat attendant at the Imperial Hotel in Lugazi. It was there that I caught the attention of a British Army officer. I had grown into a tall, strapping young man. I spoke the Kiswahili language and had little education, meaning I would readily follow orders. These traits were seen as desirable, and the officer pulled some strings to allow me to enter the British colonial army. In 1946, I began my military career as a laundry worker in the Magamaga barracks in Jinja. After a year, I advanced to the 21st King's African Rifles Karet Gili. Shortly thereafter, my unit was relocated to Somalia. I proved to be a keen, eager soldier. My courage, boldness, and cruelty were traits that marked me as a standout private. After hunting down Shifta animal raiders in Somalia, I was sent to Fort Hall, where I began training for the Scottish military band. By the age of 20, I had grown into a formidable young man. At 6'4", I weighed in at 240 pounds and was as strong as an ox. I excelled at boxing, becoming the Ugandan light heavyweight boxing champion, and was also an accomplished swimmer. Over the next 2 years, I established myself as an ideal soldier. One report described me as an incredible person who is certainly not mad, very shrewd, very cunning, and a born leader. Another report commented on my physical and mental abilities, stating, a splendid and good rugby player, but virtually bone from the neck up and needs things explained in words of one letter. In 1952, my brigade was dispatched to Kenya to fight against the Mau Mau rebellion. Here, I undertook foot patrols in the jungle to root out the rebels. My initiative was rewarded by promotion, first to corporal and then to sergeant. By the end of 1953, I had earned the highest rank that a black officer could attain in the British colonial army, Effendi, the equivalent of a warrant officer. Hunting down the Mau Mau wasn't the only thing I did while in Kenya. During those 2 years, I also fathered 2 children, a boy and a girl. They were to be the first of 35 children born to 5 wives. In 1954, my brigade returned to our base at Jinja in Uganda. When Queen Elizabeth visited, I was in the Scottish Army Band, earning the distinction of being named Best in Parade. In 1957, I led a movement among the native soldiers to get increased salaries. The initiative failed, and the Army brass expressed displeasure at this upstart move from their star soldier. Disappointment followed when I twice failed the military intelligence test. As a result, I was transferred from the field to the King's African Rifles Corps Band. Then, In 1959, I passed the Army Field Exercise Exam and was once more permitted to serve in the field of combat. I was posted to the border between Kenya and Uganda. There was a bitter rivalry between the Ugandan Karamojong and the Kenyan Turkana nomads. I arrived in the wake of a crushing British defeat at the hands of the Turkana and performed so well that a British officer described me as having restored the prestige of the forces of law and order in the region of Karamoja. In fact, I, now promoted to lieutenant, was responsible for negotiating a peace agreement with the Turkana leader, Edward Mataya. My means of achieving my ends were unorthodox, to say the least. I threatened to cut off the penis of every Turkana man who was found to be rustling cattle. And this wasn't just bluffing. I followed through on this threat and much more. In fact, the bloody manner in which I crushed the rebellion brought a level of ferociousness to the area that was simply unprecedented. In 1962, Uganda won independence from Great Britain. Suddenly, the nation had its own army. Whereas previously the native brigades had been treated as second-class soldiers by the British and were doing the bidding of their colonial overlords, now they were free of those shackles. A large number of British officers remained in Uganda to oversee the emergence of the Ugandan army. As early as 1964, I began making moves to gain military strength within the Ugandan army. My actions in putting down the Turkana rebellion brought me to the attention of Uganda's first Prime Minister, Milton Obote. He promoted the hulking young fighter to the position of Deputy Commander of the Army. I was also given command of the 1st Battalion of the Ugandan Army. In 1965, I led my battalion into the Congo to support nationalists and resist the foreign-supported government there. The mission was unsuccessful, with the Ugandan forces being repelled by the Congolese mercenaries. Later that year, I became entangled in a scandal involving the smuggling of gold and ivory. President Frederick Nutz demanded an investigation. Obote responded by making me a general and chief of staff and tasked me with the strong handling of the situation. He then had 5 ministers arrested and named himself as president. I was dispatched with an army force to the palace of President Mutsa. I personally fired a 12mm gun that was mounted on my jeep to blow holes in the president's palace walls. Mutsa, however, had gone into hiding and managed to flee to England. In 1969, Obote was pleased with the strongman tactics of his right-hand man. In 1967, he gave me supreme command over the army. That same year, I enrolled at university and took English classes. I would eventually receive a doctoral degree from the university. In 1969, my leadership of the Ugandan army was challenged. The Ugandan People's Congress was attempting to bring about reforms. They had major concerns with the tactics that I, as Commander-in-Chief, was using to exert my control. I had established a pattern of brutalizing my enemies, fomenting massacres against communities that appeared rebellious, and executing opposition leaders. Recognizing these shifting winds, I began to take courses in socialism. My brutality, however, could not be quelled. When I was accused by Brigadier General Okoye of complicity in an assassination attempt on President Obote, I arranged for Okoye to be assassinated. Meanwhile, tensions had developed between Obote and me. I had focused on recruiting soldiers from my own tribe in order to build up my personal following. Then it was proven that I had indeed been behind the attempt on Obote's life. At the same time, it was revealed that I had misappropriated 40 million shillings from the Military Operations Fund. In 1970, Obote had me fired from my position as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and instructed his attorneys to prepare a prosecution against me. To avoid arrest, I fled to Kampala. From there, I waited for my opportunity to strike back at Obote. That opportunity came on January 25th. On that date, President Milton Obote was attending a Commonwealth Summit meeting in Singapore. With the aid of Rwandan rebels, I staged a bloody coup, proclaiming myself both Prime Minister and President. Obote heard about this on the flight home from Singapore and diverted his flight to Tanzania. Over the last couple of years, Obote's relationship with the Western powers had been increasingly turbulent. As a result, the change of government was actually welcomed by Western governments. Indeed, Obote was so unpopular at home that the majority of Ugandans celebrated his overthrow. The Western powers had high hopes for this new Ugandan regime. They felt that I would be able to check Russian influence in the region. What they knew of me, they liked. I was a sportsman, a national champion boxer, and a man who had failed the Army intelligence exam, yet gone on to receive a university doctorate. What they didn't realize was that I was a dictator of unprecedented ruthlessness. My rule began with a number of concessions. Political prisoners were released, the secret police was disbanded, and I promised the people that free and open elections would be held. But it didn't take long for my true nature to show itself. I extended my period of caretaker governance from 18 months to 5 years. My reasoning was that I needed time in order to reform the government in a way that would truly benefit the nation. I began to award myself an increasingly bizarre succession of titles, including Lord of All, Beasts of the Earth, and Fishes of the Sea. In August 1972, I set my sights on reforming the economy. In doing so, I identified a scapegoat for the country's financial woes, and that was the Asians. My solution was drastic. All Asians, even those holding British passports, were expelled from Uganda. I later revealed that I had been given the message to expel the Asians in a vision from God Himself. The 70,000 affected people were given 90 days to leave the country or face arrest, imprisonment, or worse. What's more is they could only take what possessions and money they could carry with them. All property left behind would be shared among my cronies. Having rid the country of the Asian problem, I set out to rid the country of anyone who was associated with the former regime. Assassinations became routine and extended to those even just associated with the old British regime. Then British businesses and property began to be confiscated by the government. British and Jewish residents were expelled. Great Britain and Israel responded by cutting off all diplomatic relations with Uganda. Those countries also stopped supplying arms to the region. I had to find a new supply of arms. I found it in Libya. In order to achieve that agreement, I promised that country's own dictator, Muammar Gaddafi, that I would convert the nation to Islam. The Ugandan dictator also turned to Russia for military support, giving them the assurance that I would serve as a stalwart of resistance against the Western powers. I also gave my support to the Palestinian struggle against Israel. Back home, I made sweeping changes within the structure of the army. 36 leading officers were told to report to McIntyre prison for special training in subversion techniques. But when they got there, they found themselves being thrown into prison cells. All 36 were then bayoneted to death. Former Army Chief of Staff Brigadier Solomon Hussein was arrested and taken to another place of confinement. There, The men who were formerly under his command beat him to death with their rifle butts. That wasn't all that happened to him. His head was cut off and sent to me. At my new house in Kampala, I had the grisly trophy placed in the freezer compartment of my refrigerator. Top army officers at the two main barracks in the country were told that they were to line up on the parade grounds in order to salute an incoming motorcade of tanks. On both occasions, as the tanks came close, they ran off course and knocked down the startled officers. Those that weren't crushed to death were shot by waiting riflemen at yet another barracks. The officer corps were assembled in a room and told that their president was en route to deliver a lecture. But as my entourage entered the barracks, grenades were thrown into the room, and all of the officers were killed. Within a few months, nearly every trained army officer in Uganda had been eliminated. They were replaced by members of my Kakwa tribe. Men who had been tending goats in the fields became high-ranking generals overnight. I was largely able to keep the slaughter that was occurring in the army from the people as well as the international community. But when the murderous rampage was extended to the people in general, the mask of civility was ripped off. In the name of protecting the order of my regime, more than 500,000 Ugandans were killed. No one was immune, with the murder toll taking in chief justices, doctors, lawyers, diplomats, teachers, and journalists. Foreigners were also murdered. Now, just before we get into even more madness, and I promise it gets worse, like feeding heads to crocodiles worse. Unlike many other brutal dictators, I took a personal hand in the slaughter. In fact, I rather seemed to revel in it. I would personally torture people and then feed their heads to crocodiles. I also proudly spoke about eating the flesh of my enemies. And as we've already seen, I had a thing for preserving their heads in my fridge. On one infamous occasion in 1962, I was hosting a state dinner at my palace, and halfway through the meal, I left the table, only to return with the frozen head of Brigadier Solomon Hussein in my hands. My aghast guests didn't know where to look as I proceeded to direct a barrage of abuse at the head and then throw cutlery at it. The new and expanded army needed funds, and I got them by diverting much-needed tax income away from things like education, infrastructure, and health, and put it into the armed forces. Army courts were given greater prominence than civil courts. Parliament was dissolved and all ministers were threatened with arrest. The more I ratcheted up the terror, the more paranoid I appeared to become. I surrounded myself with a security detail which numbered as many as 18,000. These men doubled as a ruthless death squad, murdering, raping, and pillaging at will. On average, between 40 and 50 bodies were thrown into Lake Victoria every single day. In 1972, ousted President Obote, based in Tanzania, began making plans to retake power. Gathering his force, he made some incursions across the border. I retaliated by bombing Tanzanian towns just across the border. This effectively put an end to Obote's ambitions for power. While the murderous chaos was taking place within my borders, I was not shy about acting on the international stage. I offered to broker peace in Northern Ireland, encouraged the Scottish to break away from the Commonwealth, and told African countries that they should unite to oppose South Africa. I became the chair of the Organization of African Unity (OAU), advocating that the continent completely sever relations with the West, even went as far as to declare that I, not Queen Elizabeth, was the head of the Commonwealth. In accordance with this belief, I then awarded myself the Victoria Cross. In establishing links with Russia and Libya, I offered my support to the Palestinian Liberation Organization (PLO). When members of the PLO hijacked a plane en route from Tel Aviv to Paris in June of 1976, I invited them to land the plane at Entebbe Airport with 256 hostages. To bargain with the two PLO hijackers demanded the release of 53 PLO prisoners held by the Israelis. Early on, one of the hostages, an elderly person by the name of Durablak, choked on some food and was transported to Kampala Hospital. I threw myself into the drama. I quickly got to the airport, and in front of the hostages, images of me berating the passengers were shown all around the world. 156 passengers, all of those who did not hold Israeli passports, were soon released, leaving 100 hostages. Ironically, the Entebbe airport had actually been designed by Israeli engineers back in Tel Aviv. They were able to pull out the plans for the airport and identify exactly where the hostages were being held. The Israelis then devised a plan to rescue the hostages. In the early morning hours of July 3rd, a team of Israeli paratroopers raided the airport. In the ensuing firefight, 3 of the hostages were killed, with another 10 being injured. 7 of the hijackers, along with some 45 Ugandan soldiers who fought in support of the hijackers, were also killed, as was one of the rescuers. Overall, though, the rescue was a stunning success. I was furious with the turn of events. With no one else to vent my anger on, I ordered a couple of my thugs to the Kampala hospital. They burst into the room that Durablak was in and dragged the old woman away. She was never seen again. If the world didn't realize that the Ugandan dictator was stark raving mad, my stated intention to build a memorial to Adolf Hitler left them with no doubt. Following the raid on Entebbe, my grip on power was beginning to weaken. By now, the economy was a disaster. An attempted coup was staged in 1977. Though unsuccessful, it ratcheted up my paranoia levels to an all-time high. All of those suspected of being involved in the plot were executed, with entire army units just being wiped out. Then, in an attempt to galvanize the people, I spread the lie that the Tanzanians were about to invade. I mounted a series of preemptive strikes against the supposed invasion. However, I refused to provide their support for the ground attacks. This led to the needless deaths of thousands of my troops. The Tanzanians pushed the invaders back and then surged into northern Uganda. I had intended for the war with Tanzania to be a distraction from the problems at home, but the plan had backfired. As the troops surged into the country, locals joined them in a spontaneous effort to reclaim their country. With the ever-growing Tanzanian and local forces closing in on Kampala, I made an urgent broadcast urging the army to make a stand at Jinja. But by now, the army, too, had abandoned me, and the call was simply ignored. Seeing the writing on the wall, I, along with my 5 wives and 35 children, fled to Libya, where we were given sanctuary by Muammar Gaddafi. I left my country with an inflation rate in excess of 200%, a national debt of $340 million, and the corpses of between 300,000 and 500,000 of my own people. As the people struggled to recover under the reinstated presidency of Milton Obote, I and my family lived in relative luxury under Gaddafi's protection. However, the two despots had a falling out in 1981, and I left Libya for Saudi Arabia. Life with the Saudis was a big come down for me and my family. We now existed on handouts provided by the Saudi government. I attempted to come back to Uganda in 1988 with a small group of armed followers, but nothing came of it. The end came on August 16, 2003. I had fallen into a coma the month before. With my kidneys failing and no signs of recovery, my family decided to turn off my life support. I died with a quiet dignity that I denied so many of my victims. On hearing about the death of his former army chief, Milton Obote called me the greatest brute that an African mother has brought to life.